Before I begin for the day, let me just make a couple of very brief announcements. The first is that on Tuesday, May 14th, immediately after class, if some of you are interested, it could be one student, it could be 10, we can go have coffee and have a conversation. If there are questions that you're not able to take up, I can put aside an hour or so for that. So pretty much immediately after class on Tuesday, the 14th of this month. There may be other opportunities, but I know that that's one slot I'm free, and I put it aside for that. Okay. And the second thing is that there are some of you who have been writing, on my blog, which is very good. I appreciate that. I'm glad you're taking an interest in it, and I want to let you know that it's not possible for me to comment on everything that's been written there. Some of you have written 7, 8 comments. Some of them are quite lengthy. If I went over all of that, it would take me, a few hours to really respond to everything in detail. So I'm not able to do that. Sometimes I do respond briefly, but it's no reflection on anyone if I don't. I'm just letting you know that. And you don't necessarily have to comment only on my comments. You can actually comment as you would in some other blog on some of the people who have actually written their comments. You can try to enter into a kind of a discussion, if I may put it this way. All right. So I just wanted to make that clear to you that it may not be possible for me to respond, but I am reading everything that has been written on the essays. So the protocol for today, as it were, is I want to finish my discussion of questions having to do with development and well-being and the economic criteria that one would have to think about how India is done. Of course, there will be some questions here that will come up later on as well, in particular in week 10, where I'm going to take up once again the question that has been anticipated before. I'd mentioned it before, and that is the advent of neoliberalization policies in India, which is roughly around 1989-90. So about a decade, I would say, at least a decade later than when such policies began to be implemented in China. But it's something that I will take up later on when I take up the question of globalization. And before I move into some detail, because there are fundamentally two things I want to do in this section, I want to reserve the last 1/3 of the class to give you an introduction to the question of what's happening in Sri Lanka and the history of Sri Lanka in the post-1947 period. But with respect to this segment, the two things I want to take up is, one is I want to take up the question of the agricultural crisis in India, which is really an illustration, because one could do a similar kind of thing. For example, one could take up the so-called educational crisis in India, which, among other things, amounts to the fact that half of the country is still not literate, that if you look at the Indian state today, I would argue that the Indian state has gutted. Okay, it has basically been working towards demolishing the public institutions that exist. One of the foremost universities in the country, Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is in Delhi, which was established 50 years ago, is a university that has been under severe stress over the course of the last few years. Many of its students have been intimidated. These are students who are not sympathetic to the present regime. It's not clear why anyone should be sympathetic to the present regime, but that's a matter of personal political disposition. What's very clear is that if we do believe in something called the freedom of speech and expression, the university is certainly one place where that should be preserved. That right should be preserved. It's not going to be preserved in the university. Where is it going to be preserved? Not on Wall Street, or the equivalent of Wall Street in India, or in the military establishment. So there are serious questions of that kind, and this is really meant as an illustration, the agricultural crisis, because one could talk about the health crisis or the educational crisis or any number of crises. And as a great German Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, Walter Benjamin, once wrote, if you're a thinking person, you're always in a state of crisis anyhow, right? So the word crisis is massively overused in my view, but I'm using it here for the sake of convenience, and I've already added the caveat. Because it's not possible for me to understand how one can be really a thinking, reflective, ethical person and not feel as though one is in a crisis. I've been hearing that word, I think, since I was born, So I want you to just bear that in mind. Again, the idea is this is an illustration of how one tackles a certain set of issues, and in this case, the issue of agriculture. Now, I've picked agriculture in particular because food and access to food is obviously the most critical question at an elementary and elemental level for human beings. And there is no question that India in the colonial period went through famines. In fact, the history of colonial India is book-ended by famines. If you take 1757 as conventional histories do, so for the sake of argument, let's take that as the point of origin of colonial rule in India, a battle that is fought at a place called Plassey, so-called battle, where the British East India Company triumph, and that's the beginnings of British rule in India. Well, a decade after that, Bengal, the province of Bengal, is going to go through a famine, which is going to wipe out 1/3 of the population of Bengal. 10 million people. This is not a disputed figure, mind you. There are lots of things one can dispute. Who is responsible? What are its exact origins? What was the nature of the famine? But it's not disputed that it wiped out 1/3 of the population of Bengal. And that happened after the beginnings of British rule in India. And British rule ended in 1947. And in 1943, you have what is called the Great Bengal Famine, which killed 3 million people. Again, not disputed. What is disputed is what is the role of the colonial state. So, for example, Madhushri Mukherjee, who wrote a book about 8 or 10 years ago where she looks at the archival record, and at least from my standpoint, although she's not the first person to have established that, but this is a book which is quite exhaustive in its research, shows without any question the role of the English in exacerbating the food situation in Bengal. That food supplies were being sent from India to help the war cause. Well, what about the people back in India? And who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at that time? The great Winston Churchill, right? Who, of course, had complete contempt for Indians. If you read his writings, I mean, the man was a white supremacist, So what is unquestionably true is that there is a record of famines in colonial India. 1880s, 1890s in South India, I mean, we're talking about 20-25 million people who die on account of famine. What is also indisputably true now is that since 1947, since India became free, there has not been a famine in India. Right? I think by now I hope I don't have to argue for you that you cannot by any stretch of the imagination view me as arguing from a point of view of a nationalist, and therefore saying, this is, a reason to celebrate. Because you're going to hear the rest of the story. There has not been a famine in India since 1947. There have been places, it's been documented, where there has been acute starvation. Very small places here and there where there have been problems of starvation. But on the whole, one cannot speak of anything called a famine. Now, Amartya Sen, who wrote voluminously, the same person whose book you have been reading, An Uncertain Glory, and in fact what he really won the Nobel Prize for in many ways was his massive body of work on famines. And one of the things he argued was, you do not get famines in democratic societies, because famines are not caused by shortage of food. They are caused by inaccessibility to food. And he has a whole account, and he talks about what are called entitlements and so on. I've just given you the crux of the matter. China, if you look 1959 to 62, where 40 million people died during the so-called Great Leap Forward. 40 million people who died largely of starvation. And I think there is no question, if one reads the record, that these were people who were allowed to die. The Chinese Communist Party knew exactly what was happening. And it completely ignored all the reports it got from the provinces, because as far as they were concerned, these people were good when they were dead. You know, this was one way to obviously alleviate. It was a kind of a Malthusian view. One way to alleviate the problem of overpopulation. People who are useless, from that point of view of the state, it's well and good if they die. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party overlooked what was happening deliberately. One can give many such instances. And one reason we haven't had famines in India is because in a system of democracy, however flawed that democracy may be, there is always some notion of accountability. Some notion of accountability. There are people who are reporting what's happening, you're hearing. So the question of access to food is a critically important question. Now, food production in India has unquestionably gone up dramatically. In fact, even the critics of the Indian state have noted that there are substantial reserves in India of such things as wheat. It is another matter that these reserves are being grossly mismanaged by the Indian state, grossly mismanaged. That you have large reserves of wheat stored in silos, for example, and rats are eating away at it. Malnutrition in India is endemic. Endemic. I mean, by some estimates, I gave you the figures in my last lecture of stunted growth. That's malnutrition. That in a prosperous state such as Gujarat, 44 to 45% of the population of children are suffering from stunted growth. That's in a prosperous state. What happens when you go to Gujarat, when you go to Madhya Pradesh, when you go to Bihar? The figures are higher. So it is by no means a success story. If half the population at a minimum is suffering from malnutrition, if there are people in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions who are going to bed hungry, one cannot speak of that as a success story. Of course, one can still distinguish between malnutrition and famine, because when you have a famine such as the one that you had in Bengal, and people drop off like flies by the droves, by the millions, thousands, in instant, as it were. So that is, I think, the perspective. I think that the fact that there is increased food production, that India is now, for example, as I said, the largest producer of milk. It has considerable, in the world, it has considerable reserves of wheat, for example. India has even sent, by the way, which again I find a little ironical given how many people are hungry in India, India has even actually sent food reserves to other countries when those countries have had shortages of food, you know. All right? So let's keep that in mind. Now, that is the backdrop, in a sense, to a discussion of the agricultural crisis, and the obvious reason for that is that it is rural India and it is agriculture which has formed the backbone of the economy until relatively recent years. And we're speaking about food production, we have to have obviously an understanding of, some kind of understanding of rural India. I also suggest that you look up a website created by a man who I didn't have Anand Patwar the last time I taught this course. I had P. Sainath, who is India's most prominent investigative journalist, and he came and lectured in the class. And he set up a website. It's called PARI, P-A-R-I, People's Rural Archive of India. Okay, People's Archive of Rural India. It's an enormous website which has all kinds of information on rural India. How do we understand village? What is the place of the village in the Indian imagination? Right? Because I think we do have to understand that the village has been really the backbone. And you know, that document that I mentioned to you that was written by Mahatma Gandhi just a few days before he was assassinated, which came to be known as his last will and testament, where he talked about the multiple freedoms, and where he talked about how even though India had attained political independence, political freedom, it still had to attain economic freedom, cultural freedom, social freedom for its masses. And he discusses the 600, 700,000 villages in India, you know. And what is the nature of a village? What is the nature of the village economy? Because the nature of the village economy was you produce for yourself, and at most you produced for some people outside the village, maybe the neighboring village, and then you exchanged, right? Now this is important because the nature of agriculture, of course, shifted. It had to shift not only because of industrialization and modernization in India, but that was a global pattern. And some of the remarks that I'm making here really pertain to agriculture in the United States as well. The great poet, he's not really actually a poet so much, although he does write poetry, the great poet of the rural landscape in this country is an essayist by the name of Wendell Berry, whom I strongly recommend. Extraordinary voice. Now Wendell Berry is a farmer. He's written 40 books. He lives in Kentucky. And he describes the difference between an agrarian worldview and an industrial worldview. The industrial worldview revolves around money. The agrarian worldview does not revolve around money. It revolves around community. There is a certain relationship to the land that people develop. I think it is an unfortunate fact that probably most of us, unless you really come from a rural farming community, have no connection with the land anymore. The only connection of the land is when you go to Yosemite as a tourist. Or maybe you do a little bit hiking. Once in a while some camping under the stars. But we don't have a connection anymore with the land. That has fundamentally changed. In India, that was the norm, and it is still the norm for a great many people. But nonetheless, there has been a major shift, and agriculture now is in a state of acute crisis. How does one measure this crisis? 300,000 farmers have committed suicide between 1995 and 2015, according to the National Crime Records Bureau. These are not my statistics. These are official statistics. Official. And you know, when they're official statistics, you know they're never going to overstate the number. If anything, they're going to understate the number. The figure may well be higher. It may be 500,000, maybe even higher. And notice, by the way, the statistics are collected by the National Crime Records Bureau, because committing suicide is a crime according to the Indian Penal Code. That's the reason why they're collected by the National Crime Records Bureau. This all goes back to the colonial period. You know, because when you commit suicide, you abandon your station in life. It's also a moral crime according to Catholicism, for example. There's a view there. Some religions might say that you abandon your station in life. It's a crime. It's not for you to abandon your station in life. It's for God to decide whether you can abandon your station in life or not. And of course, you could say that there were other forms of reasoning there, but this is not a disquisition now on the philosophy of suicide. But I'm just trying to alert you to what you might completely overlook. You look at the numbers, but then don't see who's collecting them and why, because that tells us something about the nature of a society. Correct? Right? National Crime Records Bureau. But, there are years for which we don't have numbers. The numbers have been fudged. For example, the National Crime Records Bureau stated that in 2014 there were 12 states where there were no suicides by farmers. I don't believe that for a second. Not for a second, you know. They simply are fudging the numbers or trying to pretend that the problem only exists in some states for some years. And there are some parts of India that have been more adversely affected than others. The state of Maharashtra in western India there's a particular region within that called Vidarbha. I will send you a link to a blog essay I have on farmer suicides. Again, optional for you, but you'll see a little bit more information there. So the district of Vidarbha has a very high rate of suicides by farmers. And very often, by the way, the suicide is, the preferred way of suicide is they drink pesticide. That's how they commit suicide. They drink pesticide. All right. Now, there's been the landscape has shifted in India, by which I mean that the rural areas, for the first time in 2011, that's a first census that shows very clearly that rural India added fewer people than urban India. Okay, that doesn't mean, by the way, that most of India is still urban. No, you understand, right? I'm just saying more people were added for the first time in urban India than in rural India. And every study has shown that people would like to gravitate towards the cities if they can. They would like to, yes, Dominic.
Has that trend held true in subsequent years, 2012, 13, 14, like that urban areas are continuing to grow faster?
Yes, yeah. So if there's a report, which is a report called the State of Indian Farmers, released just a few years ago by CSDS, Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, which is based, of course, I mean, these are all sample surveys, right, as surveys usually are. And in this case, I think it was about, if I remember correctly, about 5,500 households, rural households, spread across the country. They found out that 76% of the farmers would rather do some other work because farming was no longer profitable. And once again, I want to reinforce the point that this is not particular to India anymore. If you have read about what's been happening to agriculture in the United States, which is a state that was considered the cheese dairy capital of the United States. Wisconsin. And most of the dairy farmers are out of business in Wisconsin now. Huge article in the New York Times about 3 days ago. Okay? Most of the dairy farmers, particularly if they're doing cheese, making cheese, are no longer in business. So it's the number of farmers in the United States, just so that you understand what the percentages are, it's only about 1.5% of the people who derive their living in the United States from agriculture. 1.5%. And the numbers have been dropping over the years. Right? So, and 61% in the CSDS study of the farmers showed that they would actually like to work in the city. So the number of farmers who would rather do some other work is 76%, but some of them would still like to stay in the village or the rural areas, but 61% definitely will want to work in the city. All right? So that's a broader context that we have to think about. Now, when I said crisis, the crisis is outlined by the fact that, or suggested by the fact that 300,000 farmers have committed suicide. There are obviously other ways to measure it. So what is the nature of the crisis? Why is there a crisis at all? And we're going to look at it very briefly, but it will give you some idea what we're speaking about. Now you have to remember that in India, a substantial portion of agriculture, much more so than in the United States, is rain-fed. Okay? Because irrigation, I mean, where's the source of water? So you can have a system of canals or other bodies of water, right? In India, a substantial portion of agriculture is dependent on monsoons, on the monsoon rains. If there's a failure of the monsoon rain, then you're going to have a failure of the crop. The monsoon has become a lot more unreliable, partly because of climate change. I haven't even really put climate change, because climate change is all over, unless one is a caveman and thinks there is no such thing. I know there are cavemen there in DC. The entire Congress is full of them, right? Never existed, never heard about it. Communist conspiracy, We want to make America socialist. Well, it's there. The climate change is in part responsible, in part. There are lots of other factors. The monsoons have become a lot more unpredictable, and there are climate refugees. There is that phrase. I didn't invent it. You know, I wish I had the genius to invent climate refugees. But there are climate refugees. India has a substantial number of climate refugees as well. The gist of it is, as far as water is concerned, there are acute water shortages, and the sources have become increasingly unreliable. Then there is a problem of minimum support price. Minimum support price is related in part, only in part, to the PDS, public distribution system, which I had spoken about last time. But minimum support price is that, let's say, for a quintal of wheat or for a ton of sugar, whatever the unit of measurement, whatever the grain or crop or food item, the government says to the farmer, this is what we're going to give you. This is the minimum that we're going to give you, right? Because how does, of course, the government accumulate all of these stocks? It buys them from the farmer. And some of these goes to these fair price shops, right? The government buys them and then sends them all these, the sugar, the wheat, etc., to these fair price shops, which are part of the public distribution system. Some of them are put away as buffer. Then you have reserves. But it pays the farmer. The minimum support price has not really gone up. It's really minimum. And there have been constant complaints. There have been lots of committees appointed by the government to look into the matter of how they can raise the minimum support price. There are international cartels which come into the picture too. But I cannot again get into the whole picture of the international dimensions of this. You know, how prices and elsewhere, those of you who are economists will have a sense of that. How prices in one place might have repercussions for prices in India, you know, if the price of cotton or wheat falls. Then there's a question of rural indebtedness. One of the reasons these farmers commit suicides is because many of them now have debts. And these debts have become a greater problem than they used to be, because even ironically, as the rural banking system has expanded. When I say rural banking system has expanded, what I mean is that there's a very good likelihood that a village will have a bank. Or if the village doesn't have a bank, the neighboring village will have a bank. The State Bank of India, to take one system, Canara Bank, these are different banks. Their tentacles are all over the country. There are thousands of branches that we're really talking about. So even though it's easier to walk into a bank, it's become more difficult to actually get a loan. The reason it's become more difficult to get a loan, and of course it's a vicious cycle, that, for example, these farmers who commit suicide, who have taken out loans, now if someone in their family, the person who inherits the farm, goes to get a loan, and then of course the bank will say, yeah, but your father took out a loan and he committed suicide. You see what I'm saying, right? It's a vicious cycle. They prefer to give loans to larger farmers, and if you look a little further down here, you'll see, this is the distribution, roughly, that 7% of all the farmers own 10 plus acres. So it's a relatively small percentage of farmers in India that you would call large farmers. And you know that for intensified forms of agriculture, you need large farms. If you're going to have very large tractors and your plot of land is very small, you can't even use the tractor efficiently. And of course there are other inputs. So one easy way to do this is you have to look at the cost of inputs. And inputs is everything you need in order to get your crop. That inputs includes the cost of water, right? It includes pesticides, if you're using pesticides. It includes fertilizer, right? It includes the cost of the seed. So if you're growing cotton, then you have the seeds. And of course, then the question is what kind of cotton. So here, one of the things I haven't brought into the picture, it's only here, it hasn't mentioned. You've all heard of this corporation, or some of you, called Monsanto, right? Which the left wing, of course, thinks is like the evil genius of the world. But Monsanto has been controlling a lot of world agriculture. There's a enormous amount of corporatization of agriculture going on, and that's one of the reasons why small farmers are being pretty much wiped out in the United States as well. Now, for cotton farmers, there's genetically modified cotton. Those seeds are more expensive. The inputs are more expensive. So therefore, you can only really survive if your crop sells at a price which is going to exceed the cost of all the inputs to begin with. And they're finding that that's not the case. Many of these farmers in Vidarbha are cotton farmers. That's what they grow, cotton. Right? But if you go back to that, you see the distribution. Find out that 19% of the farmers own between 4 to 9 acres. So you add the 19 to 7, that's 26. 26%, a quarter of all farmers are what you would describe as medium and large farmers, and the remainder are all very small farmers or landless. So landless farmers means that these are people who don't own their land at all, and therefore they're working as landless laborers. Usually when they're working as landless laborers, they're also basically day wage laborers, which means that they may not get wages if for part of the year. When the crop is being sown, when it's being harvested, then there's work, but then there are months when there may be no work at all, right? So there are all these problems, and there's, by the way, a difference at the rate at which men and women are paid, as is the case in a lot of the work and even in other countries of the world. But there's definitely a difference between the daily wage of a man, a daily wage of a woman, and a daily wage of a child. And child labor, by the way, by law is prohibited, but is rampant in all of South Asia. It's Pakistan, India, rampant, absolutely. And there's a huge ethical literature on that, which we won't get into, but just to alert you to this. So what we're talking about is, when we're speaking about rural indebtedness, rural banking systems have actually expanded, but state loans have become harder to obtain. Because usually the rate that the bank charges is substantially lower than the rate that a private money lender charges. Private money lender rates of interest are extortion, essentially. You could end up paying an annual interest rate of 50-60% easily. And so this is where the loan becomes bottomless, as it were. You pay a little bit, and by the time the years rolled around, your actual loan amount has really increased, right? So these large farmers have benefited at the expense of small farmers, and obviously most of the farmers who have committed suicide are those farmers who are small farmers, or people who don't have much land to begin with, or any land to begin with, but usually they do have some land. Usually they do have some land. You see, if you're a landless farmer, you're not likely to commit suicide because you're beginning in a position of desperation to begin with. It's the small farmers who own 1 to 3 acres of land who have been the ones who have been most vulnerable. And so, and that's what I mean by scourge of the money lender rate, right? And the irony that even though banks are now much more visible in the rural countryside than they used to be 50 years ago, it's actually become harder to get a loan. Then there is this intensification and corporatization of agriculture, which I've really hinted at, and the fact that crop rotation has given way to cash crops. So tobacco would be a cash crop. That is that these subsistence farmers or small farmers would typically have crop rotation. So one season you grow, let's say, squash. Then the second season you grow something else. That also makes the soil, by the way, more fertile. What's happened is that many of these farmers, because of the introduction of the market economy, have moved towards cash crops, where the immediate returns are much better, but these returns are very short. They last for a few years, and then you're bust. So these are some of the reasons. I'm not giving you a full-blown picture. But these are some of the reasons why there's been an enormous agricultural crisis in India. And of course we also have to say, to end on this discussion on a somewhat philosophical note, that is that, if the village has been the soul of India, then we cannot simply measure this. Certainly the most eminent Indians of the 20th century thought it was the village. Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, the great writer, many of the poets. And this is not to romanticize the village, which Mohandas Gandhi was the first person to admit was like a dung heap in many cases. Yeah? No one's idealizing the village, but you did have the notion of a moral economy in the village, that people looked out for each other. That was what the idea of a moral economy really means. The problem with this new lifestyle is we cannot judge it, as with most other things, simply by numbers and tables. It will not give us a view of what agriculture has meant to the life of the people. What is their relationship to the land? Why is it that when a person's land is stripped away, that this becomes an enormous moral crisis for the person too? It's not like losing money. You go to Vegas and you play and you lose $1,000. Well, it might be heart-wrenching, for all I know, but it cannot be the same as losing your ancestral land to a money lender, right? So you'd have to bring that dimension in when we're trying to understand this notion of what is this crisis that it's afflicting, that we can measure it. There are economic criteria. We can try to locate India in relation to the rest of the world. We can understand its international dimensions, and yet we should also understand the Indian element of it and what meaning it has for the people of that country. All right? Now, so I had started by saying that food production has unquestionably gone up, and by telling you that India has not had any famine, which I think is the case. And it is not entirely, notwithstanding the impression that some of you may have gotten, it is not entirely a story of doom and gloom in that sense. Because, of course, I've always taken the view thus far that notwithstanding everything, there is still something like a vibrant democracy at work in some respects. Right? But I think in this domain, we have to also understand what are some of the ameliorative measures taken by the state, very briefly. What are the measures taken by the state to address these problems of grave inequality, which stared the Republic in the face in 1947 when India became a free country? Right? Because now, of course, the onus was on the Indian state itself to start addressing some of these problems. So they had to, one of the questions was land reform. And some of the reading you had early on talks very briefly about that. The Zamindari Abolition Act is an illustration of that. Zamindar is a word for landlords, right? Big landlords. So in the state of Bihar, they passed the Zamindari Abolition Act in 1949, and what it did, it gave rights to the land to cultivators. Now it was challenged in the court, all right? And as the slide here points out, the Supreme Court of India ruled that land reform is exempted from challenge based on constitutional protection of fundamental rights. Let me explain that very simply. Let me translate it into simpler English. That some of the zamindars objected that being stripped of their land was a denial of their constitutional right to property, ownership of property, right? And so the Supreme Court has rules that land reform is exempted from this challenge based on the constitutional protection. That is that sometimes there have to be higher ends that the state may have to think about. Now, what were some of the ways in which, even though the state acted in good faith, how the law was subverted right from the outset? I'll give you a very simple illustration. It happens all the time, right? And again, I keep on insisting on this, and I do so because I think whenever we do this kind of work, we need to understand what is particular to a country, but what is also not so particular. Because otherwise we think, this is the problem with these people in that part of the world. I mean, I showed you a slide last time, and what was that slide that I showed you? Over here, this was a slide, sorry, and this is headlines from the New York Times. There are corporations such as Amazon, valued at 1 trillion or something, and its CEO, Bozo, or Bezos, whatever, he's $100 billion worth, right? Paid zero in corporate taxes. Not only that, by the way, they got a rebate. I hope you know that. They actually got a rebate. And the article begins with this man who makes $18,000 a year, vacuuming carpets, saying, I pay my taxes. How the bloody hell does this corporation not pay taxes? Tax loopholes, people taking advantage. I mean, it's just that these guys are mega criminals. They do it on a massive scale. The poor guy like me or someone else, you fudge a little receipt here or there, $5, $10. These guys, it's like $5 billion, I mean, shameless creatures. That's what we're talking about. Now, so what were they doing in India? You pass a law and you say there's a land ceiling. Land ceiling means you cannot own more than, let's take a figure, 10 acres of land. So how did they subvert it? Make a guess. Anyone, quickly. Yeah.
They own many plots that are 10 acres.
Yeah, but if they were all registered, let's say they were all registered, that could be one way. What would be another?
They bought them through like intermediaries.
Yeah, okay. So that's black money. But let's say that there's a court record which shows that you've got 100 acres. There's a title deed, and now it says that you're only allowed 10 acres. So what do? How do you subvert the law while still retaining everything?
Put it in the names of family members?
Yep, you got it. As simple as that. You put it in the name of, and these are joint families. There are 20 nephews and God knows how many great nephews, and yeah, that was one of the ways in which they did it. They just subverted the law. Distribution. Of course, they're going to try to keep on refining the law because they figure out soon enough that, there are these different ways to do it. But I'm only giving you, once again, an illustration of how the law was subverted. It's not enough to pass a law. And it's not simply a matter of saying that there has to be will on the part of the executive. We would have to understand the problematics and ethics of law. And I want you to think of that, because India has more progressive legislation on most things than any other country in the world. Very progressive legislation on most things in India. Now, we have to think through that yes, the Indian state has understood that you have to do that, and some of it may be well-intentioned, some of it may be working on the ground. For example, let's take an illustration, dowry. So you know what dowry is, of course. When we get to the issue having to do with gender, we'll take a much greater look at it at that point in time. But there was a law passed in 1973 which makes the giving and taking both of dowry illegal. So dowry is what is given by a woman's family to the groom. And the groom may be able to set a price. So there was this whole phenomenon in India. You don't read about it much, it still happens, but the heyday of it was the 80s and 90s, called dowry debts. Dowry debts, they're called. And one fine day in the newspaper, you open up the newspaper, page 1, a little this much, that's it. 6-8 lines in most cases, sometimes tucked away in page 5. A woman was cooking on the stove and her sari caught fire and she burned to death. So these were called dowry debts or bride burnings. And what was really happening was the woman was actually burned to death. by her husband or her husband's family. Usually it was the husband acting in collusion with the family because they had asked for a dowry. So the dowry might be, well, you have to give, let's say, the equivalent of $10,000 and a small automobile as part of the dowry. If the groom was a Harvard MBA, the dowry would be $1 million. If the groom was a citizen of the United States, the dowry would be $1 million, because that is at the man can set the price, so to speak. And if the woman does, and many of these people would claim initially that they're very liberal, they don't believe in dowry. The woman gets married, then a month after she's married, the pressure starts. They start pressuring her. You've got to pay dowry. You've got to approach your dad, have him write out a check for $50,000 for me, etc., etc. Right? This is what was known as the phenomenon of dowry debts. All right. So I'm on the subject of legislation. Now, 1973, they pass a law which states very clearly that the giving and taking of dowry is illegal. It's prohibited. You can neither offer it nor accept it. And guess how many prosecutions there were? There were probably, in a year, I would say, given how fast India's population grows, I would say probably a couple of million marriages every year, right? There are marriage seasons in India where on a single night the roads are blocked because there are these bands, at night they come out, band baja, as they call it. Let's say a couple of million marriages, and within 9 months in most cases, baby on the dot, 9 months later, right? You have to view these things with some degree of humor and irony, otherwise there's no way to live through it, right? On the dot, 9 months, baby coming, So how many people were prosecuted in 1974, 75, 76? 0. Yeah. 0. For the first 10 years of its existence, there were like 13 prosecutions for the giving and taking of dowry. And virtually every one of them would have taken and given dowry. Virtually every one. When you pass a law, it can actually have the effect of obscuring the problem. Because then people begin to think that now that you've passed the law, the solution has been achieved. South Africa had a draconian apartheid regime, absolutely draconian. I'm not making an argument for oppressive laws, I hope you understand. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be legislation, but I'm saying that legislation may actually sometimes even obscure the problem. Whether it actually helps or not is an open question. Just as you can have legislation here saying that you cannot discriminate on the basis of race. Well, that doesn't make every white person start loving black people. Of course not. It's not going to happen. Affection cannot be manufactured by the law. We have to have a very clear view of that. The law can only tell you that you cannot do this. The law cannot tell you, go and love this person, regardless of the color of their skin, or their sexual orientation, or whatever the case may be. In South Africa, after the end of apartheid, you had very progressive legislation. I don't see that the position of the vast majority of black people has changed an iota in most of South Africa. So that's a very important and interesting problematic of what is the place of law in a civil society, particularly if we're thinking about progress. All right? The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution gave the state the right to impose these land ceilings, because remember that otherwise it would have been unconstitutional, because it would have been restrictions on the right to ownership of property, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because there's enormous amounts of legislation, both central and state levels, but this is an illustration of how the state began to think of what I'm calling these ameliorative measures. Now, the most important ameliorative measure, and I will more or less end quickly with this, because I do want to get to Sri Lanka and set it up for you, is NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. subsequently renamed a few years later as MGNREGA. That's Mahatma Gandhi. That's one where you just add his name onto everything, right? To kind of legitimize it. But what was this? This act was passed in 2005. It is very often described as the largest socio-economic ameliorative measure of its kind in the world. And it did impact a huge number of people. There are very detailed studies done which suggest that it's worked quite unevenly. There are states where it has been more successful, other states where it has been much less successful. And what does NREGA do? It offers 100 days of guaranteed wage employment to one adult member of each rural household. So if you're a rural household, one member of that family is guaranteed wage employment, which was usually at a minimum wage for at least 100 days. The idea being that there's going to be some minimum, right, financial resource for this family so that they're not on the brink of starvation, as it were. Okay? That's the minimum. And there have been very detailed studies which have shown in what states it's been more effective. There were lots of problems of corruption because many of the people, you can imagine that the people who are being assisted by such legislation are people who are obviously landless laborers, working class people, most often illiterate. They don't have a checking account. They don't have a bank account. How do you transfer money to them? Simple question. How do you transfer money? Right? Do you have someone who sits there, like in the olden days, and everyone comes by and he writes out a check, or he has 100 rupees which he dishes out to each person and then has them put their thumb impression? In India, by the way, a thumb impression is legal if you're illiterate and you can't sign your name, so you put a thumb impression. Yeah. How do you transfer money? What if the guy who's dishing out the money has 4 gangsters seated next to him to ensure that out of every 100 rupees he takes 20 as his cut? So they had to do a lot of other things. Then they had to say that, well, we're going to try to ensure that every family has access to a bank, or you get a checking account established, then you link it up to an ATM machine, but that means then you need to have ATM machines in every village. And then if you have ATM machines, you have to make sure that there's a mechanic who knows how to fix them, because ATM machines are notoriously bad. They're notorious for failing, even in the US, all the time, right? So you see what I mean? That one thing leads to another. So then they had to come up with they kept on overhauling it, refining it to ensure, and here's another illustration of the problem. They wanted to make sure that the money would go to the woman, even though the worker was the male. Why? Anyone?
The man might go and spend it on drink.
That's it. Yeah. If you give it to the man, the chances are that by the time he comes back home that evening, not only has he lost that 100, but he's probably another 100 in debt, because he went to the local liquor shop and drank it all up. Which is why in India, payday is dry day. In most states in India, payday is dry day, by which I mean very simply, if you get paid on the 1st of the month in most states, on the 1st of the month, all liquor shops are closed by law. By law. So that men cannot go to the liquor shop and, drink it all up. And this way, when they get the check, they go and dutifully give it to their spouse, so she can run the household with it. Which is not to say there aren't women who are working, but this scenario was set up for men who are basically drinking. Not that they're necessarily alcoholics, of course, but you go there, one drink, no harm, and then the next thing you know, it's 5 drinks and it's 5 a.m. And you come staggering in, and then you assault your wife. Right? Those are the kinds of problems. So payday is dry day. Yeah, interesting, right? So they had to think through all of these things. You've got to, how are you going to transfer the money? Who is it going to be transferred to? Right? But this was NREGA. And here is the first page of that act, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. You can read this fine print later on when I make this slide available to you. The Constitution of India, I mentioned to you already, that India has very, very progressive legislation. So, for example, Article 41, right to work. This is a separate article, right to work. I would add Article 41A, right to not work, because work has become a modern form of oppression, but that's too sophisticated for people to think through. Why are we all living under the tyranny of work? Yeah, I mean, when did we all start working from 9 to 5? It's not been since time immemorial. When did this whole idea of work, that we are all basically slaves to work, goes back to the Industrial Revolution. This idea of work, and that's why there's a whole critique, in part, in Marx, of this. Right to equality of opportunity, Article 16, Constitution of India. Article 21, right to life of dignity. You see what I mean? I mean, flowery language, right to life of dignity. Well, of course, everybody is entitled to, one would assume that to be the case. So what does it mean? Right to life of dignity. And this Constitution is huge. It's a book. It's not like the American Constitution, which you can put into your pocket, and the last amendment was, God knows, 30, 35 years ago. In India, there are amendments every year. I mean, I don't even remember how many amendments there are to the Constitution of India now. Right? Right to Education Act. Right of children to free and compulsory education act. You see what I meant by progressive legislation? Sounds very good. And I bet you that half the people who drafted it employed child labor in their home. I'll bet you anything. So, and this is the structure that we're speaking about, that we have to think about. That there's a constitution, it's a very lofty document, it's a great document. It's very cumbersome in some respects, very comprehensive. And on the basis of that, India has come up with an extraordinarily progressive legislative apparatus. But I have tried to hint to you what some of the problems are with this legislative apparatus. And there are some things which are undoubtedly, I mean, it's sort of similar in a way if you look at the last thing, the midday school meals. In the LA County system, a majority of the children, by the way, in the LA County system are entitled to free meals. And when you fill out every year for your kids, you always get a form, even if you don't want to avail because you don't need, you're well off, you still get a form which asks you if you've got children who are entitled to free meals. Now in India, they have a big program for that. And there is no doubt that there are millions of children who are going to school simply because their parents know they're at least going to get a meal in the middle of the day, a hot meal, But and again, one can sort of discuss sort of how this scheme works. And I'll give you, again, one very interesting illustration which was not thought through. This is not to say that it shouldn't be done. See, what happened was that in many rural areas, the grains that they eat are millet, for example, and barley. Now, in these midday school meals, the children started getting rice and wheat. So there's an interesting question of how their diet is going to change. But the more interesting problem was they would go back home, and then in the evening, because the midday school meal is of course the lunch. The school closes at 3 or 4. You go back, and the evening meal you have with the family. Now the families, in many of these cases, are very poor families. And so the children started having fight with their parents, because the parents were giving them the traditional millet. And they said, no, we want rice, or we want wheat. I don't think anyone actually really thought through this. I'm not saying that I might have thought through it if I were drafting this. It's only once they started implementing it and then the researchers went out into the field and realized that, hey, this is one of many problems that we never anticipated. Because the children, you see, it creates unrest within the family, but it's also that their diet begins to change. You know, it's like if you were being fed on garbage every day, you know, fried potato chips or, you know, all of the junk food, and you just kept on eating that, and then, you know, that became your diet, as it were. Right? Which, of course, accounts for a huge increase in obesity all over the world, China being a very good instance of that, you know. Massive. China, Malaysia, places like that, which never had these kinds of problems before. All right? So the best intended measures, and we're not even doing a real critical reading of the midday school meal here and how it actually works, but let's assume, let's take the best scenario and say, yeah, good. You know, this is a way to bring children into the school, whether they learn something or not, and it also supplements their diet, right? Frees the parents from having to supervise the children. They can go about doing their work, because these are obviously poor people who can't afford childcare. I mean, right? So many things you could think about that you would say that this is a good program for all of these reasons, and yet it can lead to the kind of problem that I've given you an illustration of. All right, and then we have this, but this I'm going to save when we get to the whole question of Dalits. Okay, so that wraps up my discussion of sort of development, economic well-being, all of that. I can take maybe one question or so if anyone has one. Otherwise, I want to sort of start moving to the segment having to do with Sri Lanka. All right. Let me work my way backwards. Rather than beginning chronologically, I want to work my way backwards. One of the things I had assigned to you for this section is, well, not a singular blog essay, 3 blog essays. So I want to. So among the readings you have are 3 very short essays that I had written back in 2009, when the civil war in Sri Lanka was brought to an end. All right, and it was a really really brutal civil war, which lasted for close to three decades, 30 years. You know, I read the obituaries. I had been following it a fair bit. I had been reading about it over the years. And when the leader of the LTTE, that's the acronym which stands for Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Eelam is state, and called Tigers for short. Tigers for short. When the leader of the LTTE, which was the guerrilla force, I mean, it's really an army. You know, it's not a small guerrilla force now that we've been talking about, particularly given that it had been active for 30 years. Its leader was killed along with the chief of army staff and, of course, a number of other senior people in the whole LTTE organization. There was an obituary. I was a little... I mean, I can understand, but, you know, usually obituaries used to be written of people that one is appreciative of in some ways. Now, you know, I mean, what would it mean to read an obituary of Adolf Hitler? I don't know. Did the New York Times publish an obituary? I wonder, actually, now I'm going to check it out, of Adolf Hitler when he died. You know, what would it mean to publish an obituary, right? There's this guy you've been sort of fighting for years on end, and he's on the front page every day, you know, until his suicide in his bunker in Berlin. But what would it mean to write an obituary? So I was kind of like puzzled because I've been a dedicated reader of obituary pages for decades, you know. And in fact, I think we need to write an obituary of the obituary page because they don't know how to do obituaries anymore. You know, and there are only 3 newspapers in the world in the English language which know how to do obituaries, namely the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Guardian. in England. You know, the other newspapers have no idea how to do an obituary. So, but there were these obituaries of Prabhakaran, you know, the leader of the LTT. So I read them, and the Guardian obituary had this image. Okay, this was the image, and you can see here Prabhakaran. You know, he's seated like presidents are sometimes, you know, middle, and then the two guards on the side, and then Che Guevara, you know, on the background. Every revolutionary or self-proclaimed revolutionary, you know, loves to have Che Guevara in the background. You know, if you believe in non-violence, then it's usually someone called Mahatma Gandhi. You know, all right. So it's Gandhi versus Che Guevara. That's the history of the modern world, right? As far as revolution goes, it seems. Now, the interesting thing is that Che actually had a very short-lived life, if you know, and it cannot be said that outside Cuba that he really had a very successful run. I mean, yes, you know, he was active in Bolivia and Colombia and all of that, and there's a glamorous literature around him, really glamorous literature around him. I've been to some very obscure spots in the world, and, you know, rolling down the hills of central Bhutan 30 years ago, and what do I hear on the radio of the bus? Revolutionary songs of Cuba, right? Singing praises of Che Guevara, and his posters plastered all over. You can go to remote villages in India today, and sometimes you'll see Che Guevara, and then next to that will be Marx, and then Lenin and Trotsky, and, you know, if these are really sophisticated villagers, and Rosa Luxemburg, so forth and so on. It's really quite fascinating, you know, the history of this icon. But frankly, if you look at Prabhakaran had a much more successful run than Che Guevara. Now, how so? We need to understand why the Sri Lankan case is interesting. Apart from the intrinsic reasons, which have to do with the composition of Sri Lanka, the religious, ethnic composition, its history, because it's really, let's first understand that fully, and then I get back to Prabhakaran, that this is a very multi-religious, multi-ethnic country. Given how small it is in particular, its population is 33 million approximately, right? It's very small, a fraction of India. I mean, if you include Delhi and all the neighboring areas of Delhi, that's about 33 million. All right, that's all of Sri Lanka, on the tip of India, the teardrop, right? Now, and what is its composition? Just so that you keep that in mind, and this will be important in my next lecture, but I just want you to keep that in mind. So the Sinhalese are about 75% of the population. The Tamils are about 15.5. We have to divide the Tamils into different groups, but I won't do that now. I'll do that later. And then we have Christians, which is about 9% of the population. All right. Well, not Christians here because I'm doing it ethnically, what I call the Sri Lankan Moors. They're about 9% of the population. And then if you do it by religion, the Buddhists are 70%. So it's predominantly Buddhist. The Hindus are 12.5%. Muslims are 9.5%, between 9.5 to 10% of the population of Sri Lanka. And Catholics, so the most of the Christians are Catholics, but not all of them. Catholics are about 6% of the population, and all other Christians are about 1.5% of the population. Right? So it's really multi-ethnic and multi-religious. Now, Prabhakaran, what kind of following did he have? What kind of person was he? Right? And why is it that, as I'm making the claim, that in some ways he had a much more successful run? When I say successful, it's in quotation marks, because of course, I mean, he's shot dead, which is not a sign of being successful when you get shot dead by the state forces. But Many of the modern methods of insurrectionary warfare were originated by him. To that extent, he's a far more important person, I would argue, than Che Guevara. What were the modern methods of insurrectionary warfare that were invented by Prabhakaran? All right? The suicide bomber. The suicide bomber. And now they're a dime a dozen. You know? Suicide bombers, I mean, you know, so you saw what happened in Sri Lanka 2 weeks ago. They were all suicide bombers. The suicide bombers in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, all these places. Right? The LTTE, the Tigers, invented this. And in fact, the first, in some ways, most dramatic illustration of the suicide bomber, and I would amend this in a particular way too, which is not just the suicide bomber, but the female suicide bomber. I mean, the Tigers were really the first people to use women as suicide bombers. So of course you have to ask, how were they lured into this? As that's a question that can be asked of any organization today. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever the case might be, or white fundamentalists, how do they do it? You know, or the suicide bombers haven't really become common in white terrorism, as it were, but you know, you just have your hair, you know, you just go buy a machine gun, you know, from Grouse, as it were, and just go about shooting up people. It's quite simple, you know. Right? But there, you know, it's suicide bombers, right? So what is a dramatic illustration? When the Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, well, he was no longer Prime Minister at this point, he was campaigning. The Indian state had sent what is called an Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, to intervene in the dispute that was happening in Sri Lanka. And there was a huge amount of resentment against this Indian Peacekeeping Force, particularly from the point of view of the Tigers. And so when he was campaigning in the south, and Rajiv Gandhi was the son of Indira Gandhi, right, who had been the prime minister herself. This woman who had bombs strapped to her, and she had a vest, and then she came up to Rajiv Gandhi to sort of render respects to him with a bouquet of flowers, and blew herself up. And this was 3 decades ago, and she was a Tiger. She was a member of the Tigers. Right? So they pioneered this. They pioneered the whole use of suicide bombing and the female suicide bomber, and the use of the internet for fundraising. I mean, no sooner was the internet born than the Tamil diaspora swung into action. There's quite a lot of trail here that we have, paper trail and cyber trail, of the way in which they were able to actually work with the Tamil diaspora and use the internet for increasing their funding. I have to say, of course, by the way, that the Tamil Tigers are not the first secessionist group or revolutionary group in the world, or organization of that kind, which has relied on the diaspora. Right? The classic example is well before the beginning of the internet age. I'm talking about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, you know, which when the Republic of Ireland was created, when you had the partition of Ireland and you had the 6 counties which still stayed in Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, and then you had the 26 counties in the south which became part of what is called the Republic of Ireland. So the problem goes back, of course, much earlier, but that was the partition of Ireland in the 1920s. That the IRA had a massive following among the Irish in the United States. Boston was one of their main strongholds. So insurrectionary groups will do that. This is not the pioneering. The pioneering by the Tigers was the particular manner in which they were able to deploy the resources of the diaspora using the internet. So internet, suicide bombing, the use of child soldiers, which you have heard about in some cases in Africa, in the Congo, for example. That's been an issue there. But this was really something that the Tigers did, okay? And very extensive deployment of children. And when this war took place, what we need to really understand, and in my lecture on Thursday I'm going to go back to the origins of the conflict in Sri Lanka, and the idea is not to simply understand one conflict there, but to understand, in a sense, what are some of the difficulties that every multi-religious, multi-ethnic society will have to think about, right? But what was particular about this war was not simply that it was a 30-year war, a protracted war, but it was really the extraordinary brutality involved in the war. So in the last days of the war, which was in early May of 2009, there were allegations by the Sri Lankan forces that the Tigers had used many civilians as human shields. Now, you know that state forces often make that argument against guerrilla groups. In this case, that allegation was unquestionably true. Unquestionably true. The Tigers really had no scruples at all. What is unfortunate, and they did use women and children as shields. You know, there's no question about that. But what is, I think, also the case is that the state was equally brutal. And I think they actually set it up in some respects for the Tigers to use civilians as human shields in part, right? So it was a war in which no quarter was given on either side. And the puzzle that we want to try to work out, I'm going to try to explain to you what I mean by the puzzle in my next lecture, is what does this case tell us about multi-religious, multi-ethnic societies and how we can live together? Okay? All right, so we'll stop there.